The multitude of early Greek manuscripts have been the source for the New Testament scriptures produced through time. An organized and consistent collection of those Greek texts was needed to enable the most complete and comprehensive representation of the New Testament. The Textus Receptus efforts consolidated all available Greek texts and filled that need. The earliest Bibles, including the Greek codices Vaticanus, Alexandrinus, and Sinaiticus, as well as the early Latin translations Vetus Latina and the Latin Vulgate, faced the challenge of creating an accurate and complete set of scriptures. When those works were being created, many different copies of the earliest Greek manuscripts were available, and possibly even a few original writings from the first century. The challenge was to select and organize those available manuscripts and condense the text down to an organized set of scriptures. An added challenge faced by the first Bible creators was that many early source Greek texts had variations in the content, and some manuscripts included sections that other related manuscripts excluded. For several centuries after the first early Greek and Latin works were created, few other major combined scriptures were produced. Translators faced the same challenge to consolidate the available source texts, and few were successful enough to be considered marginally better than those early Greek and Latin works. To address the need for a better consolidation of early Greek and Latin source scripture text, Desiderius Erasmus, a 16th century Dutch theologian and scholar, created a refined collection of available Greek and Latin texts. The combined work included a vast amount of scholarly annotations and supporting information to assist readers in recognizing and understanding the variations and corrections made to contemporary scriptures to better align the text with the original source manuscripts. Erasmus released the first edition of his combined work in 1516 with the Latin name Novum Instrumentum Omne, which was later renamed Novum Testamentum Omne. The work was a combined Greek and Latin version of the New Testament with many improvements and clarifications to the text. The extensive number of annotations provided documented the different possible interpretations of the translations. Erasmus didn't believe a simple, straightforward translation was sufficient to convey the original meaning to the target language. He didn't simply provide a definitive list of scripture verses, but rather a combination of those verse variations. He stated in his preface, "In a translation, you can only express one meaning, but with the help of annotations, it is possible to suggest various shades of meaning, leaving the reader free to choose." This innovative approach allowed for and supported a wide application of biblical text translations and contributed to a virtual explosion of new Greek scripture translations just as the Protestant Reformation was taking shape. Modern examination and assessment of Erasmus's work reveals some content deficiencies and biases. Erasmus's later editions placed a higher importance on existing canonical traditions than that of the source texts. When existing tradition wasn't clearly or sufficiently represented in either the Greek or Latin versions, he would update either or both of those texts to better align with tradition. He also favored the translated Latin text from the Latin Vulgate over the original source Greek, and various instances exist where the Greek text was modified instead to align with the existing translated Latin. Erasmus did not possess a full copy of the Book of Revelation in Greek, so he retranslated the existing Latin from the Vulgate back into Greek. The combined New Testament collection Erasmus created became the first entry into a group of texts later known as the Textus Receptus. Textus Receptus is a Latin term meaning received text, and it represented an extended effort to create and maintain what was seen at the time as the most complete and accurate collection of Greek and Latin scripture text. Erasmus published the first of his editions in 1516, followed by 4 more editions released in 1519, 1522, 1527, and 1535, for a total of 5 Textus Receptus editions. A controversy surrounds his 3rd edition, published in 1522. Erasmus began his work with more emphasis placed on the authority of the source Greek texts, and his first 2 editions of 1516 and 1519 reflect this. However, over time, he experienced increasing pressure from officials and supporters of the Latin Vulgate to update his work to reflect the differences found in the Vulgate. One such difference was the Johannine comma, Trinity verses 1 John chapter 5, verses 7 and 8. The Vulgate included those verses, but Erasmus could find no corresponding Greek text that supported them. Erasmus refused to add any text into his Textus Receptus editions if he could not find the text represented in any source Greek manuscripts. Erasmus continued to receive increasing pressure to include the Johannine comma text, but he remained firm, stating that he would only ever include the text if it was first found in a Greek manuscript. Oddly enough, shortly after Erasmus declared this position, a new and strange Greek manuscript was mysteriously discovered, and this new manuscript did conveniently include the Johannine comma text. Erasmus was not able to refute this new Greek manuscript, and so was obliged to include the extra text in his next edition of the Textus Receptus. One way to characterize and compare an early collection of scripture text is by noting which sections of the text have been added and which ones have been excluded. 3 examples of differing text sections are the Johannine comma, Trinity verses 1 John chapter 5, verses 7 and 8, the ending of the Gospel of Mark, short or long, and the story of the adulterous woman, John 7:53 through 8:11, known as the pericope adulterae. The Erasmus Textus Receptus editions began by excluding the Johannine comma text, but then later included it. He was consistent across all editions by including the long ending of the Gospel of Mark and the story of the adulterous woman. Other scholars and theologians that dedicated themselves to the consolidation of Greek scripture text also created works that became separate editions of the Textus Receptus. Following are 3 of the more predominant contributors to the list of Textus Receptus works. Stephanus. In 1550, Robert Etienne, also known as Robert Stephanus, or more commonly simply as Stephanus, published his work Editio Regia, Latin for royal edition. Even though the 1550 release was actually the 3rd edition created by Stephanus, it was the version that became the most widely recognized and used. In 1527, Italian scholar Santes Pagnino added verse numbers to the New Testament text. However, this idea of dividing and identifying verses wasn't adopted as a common practice at the time. The early source Greek manuscripts contained no such divisions. As part of his work organizing the Greek texts, Stephanus reintroduced the practice of dividing the New Testament text into chapters and numbered verses. The 4th edition of his work, published in 1551, was the first widely available Greek New Testament that included chapter and verse reference numbers. Although some adjustments were made to the Stephanus verse numbers, over time they largely became standardized and are what we now take for granted in the modern Bibles of today. The consolidated scriptures in Greek from Stephanus became additional additions to the Textus Receptus series and influenced the future work on other Textus Receptus creators, as well as one of the earliest Bibles in English, the Geneva Bible. Beza. In 1562, a predominant Vetus Latina manuscript was stolen from the monastery of St. Irenaeus in Lyon, France, by the Huguenots and was given to Theodore Beza, a theologian and scholar living in Geneva. The manuscript eventually became known as the Codex Beza due to its being in the possession of Theodore Beza for many years. Beza only used the Codex Beza to a minimal extent, missing the opportunity to include additional Greek scripture examples in his work. Instead, he relied more heavily on the earlier Textus Receptus editions from Stephanus, and retained the chapter and verse numbering practice Stephanus had established in his works. The works created by Beza was formatted with 3 columns. The first was the established Greek common to most Textus Receptus documents. The second column was the associated Latin directly taken from the Vulgate, and the third column was Beza's new Latin translation of the source Greek. Beza's compiled Greek and Latin New Testament was published in 1565 and over time became a great contributor to the popularity of the Textus Receptus collections used as translation mechanisms for future English Bibles. Later, in 1581, Beza gifted the underutilized Codex Beza to the University of Cambridge in England, where it remains today. Elzevir. Bonaventure Elzevir and his nephew Abraham were members of an established and successful printing and publishing family. They took Beza's Greek and Latin New Testament, made a few dozen minor modifications to the Greek text, and in 1624 republished the Greek as a new version of the Textus Receptus. The term Textus Receptus was not used to describe the Greek consolidated works during the time of Erasmus and Stephanus. It wasn't until much later, when Elzevir's second edition was published in 1633, it contained a preface that included a Latin message that stated, "Therefore you have the text, now received by all." The Latin words textum and receptum stood out among scholars and other readers. Over time, the term Textus Receptus became the generally accepted name for those various Greek coalitions and translations created by Erasmus, Stephanus, Beza, and others. By the time the Elzevir editions were produced, the content of the source Greek and associated translated Latin had become largely standardized, with only minor deviations being acceptable from the collectively agreed upon canon content. Without exception, the later editions added to the Textus Receptus list were consistent with their inclusion of text sections previously in question or absent in many early Greek manuscripts. The received text created by Erasmus, Stephanus, Beza, and the Elzevir family set the stage for a wave of new Bible translations starting in the 16th century and continuing through today. The Textus Receptus works directly enabled the creation of many predominant and influential Bibles, including the earliest English Bibles, Tyndale, Geneva, Bishops, as well as the original King James Version and all the King James family of Bibles. The impact of Textus Receptus text cannot be overstated. The carefully compiled translation information found there has allowed us to have the Bibles we read and love today.